Hi, and welcome back to White Noise. It is October. It is nearly Halloween. Leanna and I are steaming more than Thomas the Tank Engine. And today we're going to talk about horror comedies to start off our 7-day special for our podcast. Yeah, I don't know how organized this is going to be or how chaotic it's going to be. I'm already losing my train of thought as I speak. Originally, I had an idea of we could do this as kind of like the history of horror comedies because Leanna did so well last year when we did our cursed, banned, and controversial films. I didn't prepare enough for that. So whatever this is going to be is what it's going to be. But to start this episode off, after just watching a couple of horror comedies over the past couple of days to prepare, I have a controversial opinion and request of directors looking to get into horror. Stop trying to make horror films and just focus on horror comedy. Because my God, I didn't realize the spectrum that horror comedy is until I actually started looking into it, because it makes sense now, but I wouldn't have counted films like Ready or Not and things like that as horror comedies. Well, no, I rewatched it again last night and I was like, well, obviously. But at the time, I was like, it's so horror. Because when I think horror comedy, I think stuff like Scream or The Lost Boys or What We Do in the
Fright
Shadows.
Night, maybe.
But this is what I mean. There is such a spectrum that it's like, you know, where does this film fit from Ready or Not to Shaun of the Dead? Like there is such a vast.
That's a good point. I guess it's the same as it is, I guess, with like drama. Some drama leans to like sad and melodrama, and some, you know, you get dramedy. You know, it's just a spectrum of a genre, isn't it? I guess. But like horror comedy, do you know what? It's got to be one of my top tier. Honestly, absolutely obsessed.
Well, the thing is, when people would ask me like what my favorite genre of films are, I would always say like probably horror because I love horror films. But now that I've realized how many of some of my favorite horror films fall into horror comedy, I would say horror comedy. And also just again going back to my plea for directors to just focus on making horror comedy films. We've spoken about before how like making a horror film in this day and age is really difficult because there's desensitization, the fact that everything's been done before. It's really hard to make something original and gripping. And also everybody's scared by different things now. There's obviously a huge shift towards societal horror because people are just scared of real life. Like Ghosts and Ghoulies don't get people like they used to. If anything, people just want to fuck the Ghost and Ghoulies. But when it comes to like real life criminals or just the criminality of the social system we live in, that's what gets people. But horror comedies are that sweet spot. It's like there are films that, you know, there are horror films that you would watch and you would be like, oh, this is a bad horror film. But then you would realize it's a horror comedy and you'd be like, that's why. Like it wasn't bad. It was just meant to be funny. Yeah.
I mean, there's like that. It goes back so far, doesn't it? Like I don't really know what would be considered the first, but I just feel like since like Scream in the 90s, obviously it happened way sooner. We got like Evil Dead and shit, but like since I'd say Scream, there's just been a fucking influx of them, hasn't there? Like, you know, you got Ginger Snaps in like I think that was 2000, Super Whitey.
Oh yeah, classic.
Then you've got stuff like Cabin in the Woods, Jennifer's Body. I would call a horror comedy, quite honestly.
Do you know Cabin in the Woods for me is like a really classic example of I saw Cabin in the Woods when it came out in the cinema and I was like, oh, this is pretty shit. But then watching it years later, I'm like, oh, it was meant to be.
I was the exact same. I truly just thought it was meant to be this like horror film about horror films. And I was like, but it's not funny. But then I think I was looking at it through the wrong lens.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like it's supposed to be taking the piss out of like shit horror films, you know? I just thought it was like mocking horror films. I didn't really get that it was like a love letter, but in like a different way to how Scream is. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I feel like this is the one problem you can face with horror comedies is like if it's advertised the wrong way, then you might not enjoy it. Because like, did you ever watch Freaky? That came out like
yes, I did. Yeah.
That got advertised wrong. Like I really enjoyed it, but like it was way more comedy than horror. I thought.
This is what I mean. It's weird because it feels like when it comes to horror comedies, the marketing, like you said, is where it really falls short because why can't it's almost like people won't accept that horror comedies are a thing, and it's
Yeah,
like they want people to be shocked when they go into it. So it's either like freaky that they market it as a comedy, and then you have those pretty intense horror moments and it's like, oh
yeah.
okay, or you have Scream that's marketed as a horror film and then you go into it and it's like, oh my, this is actually
It's
pretty
actually quite
funny.
funny. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I feel like because the marketing tends to, I guess I do get it though, because like when if you're like a film marketing person, you kind of have to pick a genre, which is so silly because not every film is in one genre. Like, I mean, it's getting better. Look at say fucking Parasite. You know,
Yeah.
like that has a lot of comedy in it, and they did manage to include that a bit in the marketing. But like, yeah, say with a lot of horror comedies, you don't really get that come across. It's like they either lean into the horror aspect or the comedy aspect. Let me think of like an example, like Tucker and Dale versus Evil. Like that
Mhm.
lent a lot into it being comedy, but it's got some really fucking good horror moments in
Do you
there.
know what? Tucker and Dale versus Evil is I'm so glad you brought that up because I
Mm.
always feel like I'm the only person that's seen that
No,
film.
I feel the same. Yeah.
Like me and a friend stumbled across that film, I think on Netflix one day, and we watched it, and I was like, this is debatable. I'm also quite
Brilliant.
drunk, so I might be wrong, but I think on par with the way Scream was done, that the comedy that's put in it and the way it plays off of horror tropes is so clever.
Yeah.
Like the storyline obviously is stupid, but it's meant to be. But the horror trope of like you've got this group of kids, teenagers who obviously would be really suspicious of strangers and them dying in these really ridiculous
Mm.
situations, but like it fits so well into stuff like Friday the 13th, where, you know, obviously in Friday the 13th, it was meant to be serious, these
Mm.
all these deaths, but the way they fit so perfectly as comedy scenes in Tucker and Dale versus Evil just kind of proves how horror and comedy are
It's so
just so
like, yeah, and it just like works so well, like Hills Have Eyes homage, and like it
mhm.
just works as a homage as well as a comedy or a horror film, doesn't it? Because like, you know, when they look super creepy from like the teenagers' point of view and stuff, but you know them as these dopey fucking like I hate
Yeah.
to say it, but hillbillies and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Like, I just think like horror comedy is such a like I don't even want to call it like unrecognized genre because it fully is. You just kind of like once you start getting into it you get into it. And I just wish
Mhm.
more people had seen like more of the classics. But then I feel like they have and they just don't know it. Like Happy Death Day.
Yeah.
A lot of people have seen Happy Death Day and
Mhm.
What We Do in the Shadows, masterpiece.
Oh,
Absolute.
yeah.
That is probably like top 10 horror comedies of all time, isn't it? But like,
Yeah.
you know, you were just saying about like filmmakers, they should start in it. I feel like it's such a good exercise in like genre, you
Mhm.
know, because it's like, oh, I need to be like absolutely incredible with my timings because it's got to hit on a comedic note and a
Mhm.
horror note, you know? And I think that's like why What We Do in the Shadows like perseveres because it does. I will say it is more comedy than it is horror, but there are
Mhm.
moments in What We Do in the Shadows we're like, damn, like where they're like fucking like actually biting people, and you're like,
Yeah.
yeah,
This is the thing though, like you do have films like that that do fit more into one than other.
oh yeah,
But when
definitely,
you step back and really look at them, you can't deny that horror comedy is their genre.
yeah,
Like it's not just, oh, these films happen to fall between both genres. They were intentionally created
yeah,
to, like you said, be a homage to horror, but have that kind of accessibility of comedy. I think that's the thing. Like, as much as I love horror films, especially being with somebody who isn't the biggest horror film
mm,
fan, those horror comedies are a really good in between
yeah,
moment for people to enjoy together because I get it. I mean, debatable. You could even say that Saw is a horror comedy, but you know, you don't want to watch something like Saw with somebody who hates horror or gore,
mm,
but something like Tucker and Dale versus Evil.
yeah,
Actually, I can't believe I didn't think about this until you said it, but it's a really good example because it has a lot of those really high end kind of horror tropes that people study, but
mm.
performed in a way that I feel like anybody could really watch them.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's so much more like approachable, you know?
Yeah,
And I feel that way about say something like Scream. We're gonna talk about Scream a lot here, let's be
yeah.
real. It's such a good example of like meshing the genres in a way where they like complement each other.
Hmm.
You know, so like the horror brings out the comedy and the comedy brings out the horror. And I think like my personal favorite example that isn't Scream is probably, I don't know if you heard of it, One Cut of the Dead.
No, I haven't heard of it
Oh, it's
actually.
this like Japanese mockumentary horror comedy. It's
I
about like,
do love a mockumentary.
yeah, it's kind of like, so it's like a film set for a zombie film where like some people's makeup is a bit too good. And it's like, it is, so like the first bit is like a film, and then it's showing that it's people making a film, and then it's people actually getting attacked by zombies on the film set, but they think it's part of the film. And it's, oh my god, it's there's layers to it. You have
It
to,
kind of sounds like Wreck.
it's kind of like yes and no, but like
Yeah.
One Cut of the Dead is so good. You have to watch it because it has all these brilliant like long takes, because
Mhm.
of course it's trying to look more like it's actually people in danger. It's not
Mhm.
trying to look like a horror film. It's like someone just running around with a camera like holy fuck, like sprinting away. And it's so good because like even the zombies that are real, their makeup looks stupid like it would in a
Yeah.
low budget zombie film. Oh my god,
Mhm.
you, I can't believe you've never seen One Cut of the Dead. You
Do you know
gotta
what? I
see it.
think this is even like my own personal preference. Like, you know, like you just said, Scream is definitely not the first one that did it, but I would argue, and I'm sure you would, and a lot of people probably would as well, it is like the biggest example of a horror comedy.
Yeah.
But you know, we've spoken about quite recently, keep an eye out for some later episodes for this Halloween season for White Noise, but we spoke about how in Scream, ironically, one of the things that's used for a comedic effect is one of the most horrifying things is that it's so real. Like Ghostface stumbling over and the scraps, you know, it doesn't look rehearsed. It looks like a fucking mess, but
No, literally,
that's
yeah.
actually what makes it scarier, because as everybody knows, life isn't a film, romantic, horror, comedy, otherwise, it's not a film. So you have those awkward kind of chaotic moments, and Scream really captures that. And I feel like that's why the more I think about it, horror comedy really is one of my favorite genres, because I really love meta-ness, I love nuance, I love dramatic irony, and horror comedies always tend to hit that. I know there are going to be examples, and I would love people to leave them in the comments, but I really can't think of a horror comedy that kind of didn't deliver in some way, because you can get away with so much. Like mistakes that get made in horror comedies, who's to say they were mistakes? Maybe they were spontaneous, maybe they were ad-libbed, maybe they were just improvised. You can really get away with a lot.
It's just kind of like they all have something to provide and give, you know?
Yeah.
There's, I don't know if you ever heard of it, there's this film called Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon.
The
And it's
name
supposed to
rings
be
a
like a
bell.
document, it's like a mockumentary, it's like a documentary crew, like, oh, we're gonna follow a serial killer as he has his night of kills, you know, like it would be like Michael Myers on Halloween. And it's kind of like it flips and they become the victims and stuff like that. And it's not a good film. It's not a good film by any means. I mean, I've not seen it since fuck knows. I was quite, it wasn't long after it came out, so I'd been quite young when I saw it. But even then I thought it wasn't that great. But then I wonder if that was because I was expecting it to just be comedy or just be horror, and I wasn't really old enough yet to appreciate a comedy horror. So it's like when I was younger as well, like Shaun of the Dead, I just saw it as a straight horror film. And to be honest, I still low-key do. Like I see Shaun the Dead as more of a horror film than a comedy, because I actually find Shaun the Dead, I find Shaun the Dead quite scary, but then I find zombie films quite scary. I find zombies like actually terrifying.
Yeah, fair.
But I think it's because I saw too many zombie films when I was young. Like I probably saw it too young, so I remember the horror more than anything. But like,
do you know,
maybe if I
for
rewatched
me,
Behind the Mask now, I would find it funnier.
well, do you know what film for me was kind of like that, where I think I really started to appreciate that horror comedy was a thing, was the film Creep.
Yes.
The guy's name's escaping me right now. Is it Mark Duplass?
Don't really remember.
If that's wrong, I'm sorry, somebody correct me. But I remember I was at uni, we were intoxicated, and we just happened to come across the first Creep film, and we watched it and we were like, this is really fucking weird, but it's really funny. But then I tried to get a friend of mine to watch it, and we weren't in the state of mind to watch it. All I will say is, if you haven't seen it, it's one of those films that I don't really think you can watch sober for one reason or another. But I tried to get my friend to watch it, and she didn't really get it. And I was really frustrated, because I was like, how can you not tell this is funny? But then in kind of like one of our last episodes, when we talked about Old Boy and Park Chan-wook films, is like, they're funny, but you can't say why, because when you describe the moment out of context, it sounds
all
really
in the vibe,
weird.
isn't it? Yeah.
Same thing with Creep. But I think that's when I realized, because I was like, I don't think it was a bad film at all. I get that you can't enjoy it, but there's something about it that, like, I don't really think you can say it's a bad film. However, I couldn't figure out why I couldn't say to people, oh, this is really good, you should watch it. It was just one of those films I was like,
Watch
You just
it.
need to watch this. You just need to have
But then
experienced
have you
this.
ever seen Tusk?
Yes. Oh.
Like, that's the exact same thing. I couldn't say to someone, this is an incredible film, but I'm almost like, you need to see this film.
Honestly, I feel like I can't maybe because it was the comedy side of it, right? But I feel like Tusk fucked me up more than the Human Centipede
I
did.
honestly found Tusk quite disturbing, and I think it's because I went in just thinking it was going to be like really funny. So then when it actually got to some of the like body horror bits, I was like, what the actual fuck?
I think that's the thing though. It was the body, because we've said before how like body horror is one of our like top. We're out of the can't do
That's
it.
why, but then that's kind of for me like the overlap with say zombie films, because that kind of can fall in that category.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know what I
yeah.
mean? But yeah, to go back to bloody Tusk, what a bloody film! I got sneak attacked with that film in uni. Like a guy I was friends with was like, guys, like this horror comedy, and I thought I love a horror comedy, you know. And in my head, you know, the first bit, and like who pops up? Who is it that's quite famous? Is it Johnny Depp?
It is Johnny
Not
Depp,
to
yeah.
name, but like you
We'll
know,
bleep that out.
we'll bleep that
Yeah.
out. But like so and so pops up, and it's just like, what the fuck is going on in this
Do you
film?
know what though? It's one of those things where it's like, I know it sounds really stupid, and obviously with this film, especially because of who it is, but you know, when you're watching kind of a fucked up film and you see a celebrity that you recognize, it's almost kind of like a safe zone. I can't explain it, but you
No, I
feel
get what
kind
you're
of
saying.
comforted
Yeah,
that
but
they're
then
in
I don't
it.
know if I feel that way. I feel like it makes me a little bit disoriented.
Fair enough.
You know?
I just know that, and honestly, I think for me it was the ending of Tusk, because on par with the Human Centipede,
Yeah.
traumatic ending.
You
I
know
don't
what?
care how goofy it looked; it was
Yeah.
traumatic.
I will say Human Centipede has a lot more comedy in it than people realize.
Yeah.
In a really dark and horrible way, but it really does.
But you know what though? This is why what I think makes horror comedies, and also horror films that don't start out to be horror comedies but have a lot of comedy elements, they make them so much more disturbing, and they linger with you longer because again
Yeah.
it feeds into that real life awkwardness. It's not even necessarily comedy, it's the awkwardness in a
No, I agree.
situation.
There's like things in life don't fall straight into one genre, do they?
Mhm.
So I completely get what you're saying. It just makes
Yeah.
it so much more like eerie and like I don't know what word I would use. I'm looking for a certain word, but it just
I
makes it
think
all a bit
Aries
more poignant and hit a bit more, you know?
I think eerie is a good word. It's just a shame that eerie has like more horror and creepy elements.
Connotations, yeah, that's fair.
But I would Uncanny Valley. Even Uncanny Valley isn't quite right because it's
No,
not like
but
it's
getting that
mimicking.
kind of weird
Yeah.
middle ground kind of thing. Like, you know, I've just come to mind now is that film. Have you ever seen it, The Final Girls? Oh, I thought it was shite. Like people always talk about it as this brilliant horror
I
comedy.
have seen
It's like
people like
people getting trapped.
yeah.
The concept is genius. So it's like a girl whose mum was in a classic horror film, and then she gets trapped in that film after her mum passes away when like she's quite a young mum. And it's kind of like she gets to be around her mum again, but her mum's the character because they're in the world of the film. That is such a fucking good concept. But then it's like that it I don't know how to explain it. It just tries to do too much because it's like that's already such a high, what the fuck would you call that? High, it's so high concept already.
Yeah.
That to then also be trying to play with like horror and comedy and everything, it all kind of gets a bit like out of control and a bit too much.
I'm guessing that this is like a recent film as well.
Yeah, I think it's like 20, probably like 14, 15 or something.
See, this is another thing that I feel like, just like everything, horror comedies have become quite polished. So it's like even the comedy doesn't really work. Like, don't get me wrong, there is like a certain overload of comedy that even I can't really take. Like it does get a bit too slapstick, a bit too, it depends on the moment, but I feel like it gets like a bit too much. Whereas, and this is why films of like the noughties to an extent, and then you go a bit back further, the 90s, the 80s is debatable because I'm thinking, was it a horror comedy or was it just camp?
It could be argued, and I mean, we could get into a whole fucking trove of films right now, starting with The Lost Boys.
This is the main one I'm thinking of, exactly, because I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, you know, because I said to you recently, Anna, I showed my partner The Lost Boys, and she's not super into horror films, but I had a feeling she might like this one. Like she really likes 80s, like the music, the style, everything. So I thought that would go for her. but I realized that even though there obviously are quite visceral moments, I think is the best way to put it. The main one I'm thinking of is obviously when they attack the guys at like the beach.
I always forget about that bit till it rolls around because it's at the
But
lower points in the film, isn't it?
that's what I mean. But then there are moments where I'm like, even that scene was quite comical because of the special effects. But then this is where I come into, was it horror comedy or was it just camp? Because the 80s were obviously very limited in their special effects. Also, the thing I always pick up in The Lost Boys that I haven't seen anyone talk about, even though I feel like it's glaringly obvious, is nearing the end of the film when they go to the cave to try and stake the head vampire, and the Frog Brothers stake one of the vampires and they get covered in goo. That goo is glittery. It glitters. Like Stephanie Meyer can claim all she wants that she had a dream that created Twilight. She fucking watched The Lost Boys and that's what happened.
I honestly don't know how I didn't realize how camp and silly that film was until like the last few years, because it just feels like it's slapping you across the face with it.
But this is what I mean. Like,
I love it.
This is a debate you can definitely have. Let us know. The Lost Boys is a clear example, but were horror comedies from the 80s actually horror comedies, or were they just gay?
A really good other one is fucking staring us right in the face, and that's Nightmare on Elm Street 2. Was that ever meant to be funny and camp?
Yeah. Honestly,
I think
it
was a bit intentional. Have you ever watched the documentary on it?
I have recently, because you did tell me to watch it.
Green Queen, hell yeah.
It's changed my opinion of it. However, I don't deny anything, that they said in it, but I am also very much of the mindset of a lot of stuff is easy to say after the fact. So my opinion is based on in the moment when it happened, when it was created. Nightmare on Elm Street 2, yes, horror comedy without a doubt, but then to me the entire franchise is horror comedy, and that's why I love it.
Well, I mean, the first one clearly is, what's great about Nightmare on Elm Street is you can go in thinking of it as either or.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? Like in a way you can't do with other stuff, because it's like, other like franchises got silly later on, but Nightmare on Elm Street was that way from the beginning. Like the first one is scary, don't get me wrong. Like honestly, sometimes you go back and watch Nightmare on Elm Street in the right mindset and it's like, oh my God, this is a bit horrifying. But like there are some funny fucking moments in that film, intentional or not, I fucking love it, mate. Another one that I'd say is more intentionally funny, but does have its scary moments is Fright Night. What?
Oh yeah.
A
your
bloody
child,
film.
your baby.
Oh, I love Fright Night. Honestly, it's one of those ones where I'm just like, why didn't it get the love that some of the other films from the 80s did? Like, don't get me wrong, it's still big and people know of it, but like I hate that. How do I explain? So like, you'll be chatting to people about like funny horror films or like horror films from the 80s, and like they'll maybe have heard of The Lost Boys but not seen it, but like no one's even heard of Fright Night unless they're like a genre fan. I'm like, oh my God, you're so
Do you know why I think it is?
Mm.
I think it's because obviously with it coming out in the 80s when you had stuff like Scream and Nightmare on Elm Street, blah, blah, it didn't have an iconic
It
villain.
didn't. No, yeah, it didn't have that visual for it.
Yes.
Yeah. But like, and also I think it's quite a like homage to like Hammer horror, and it starts with him loving, Peter Vincent, which is a reference itself to like Peter Cushing, and Vincent Price. And obviously it's like kind of like super like Christopher Lee vibes, and that itself is a bit homoerotic, I would say, that film. Not Jerry, not the main vampire, but his mate.
Yes.
Living servant. That's all a bit.
Who I'm sure in the remake kind of gets eviscerated.
Yeah,
like
completely.
Just gone.
We don't even talk about the remake because the remake loses like that comedy. Do you know what I mean? But then again, that's that question we're having of like, is that just because they were unintentionally campy? These are 80s horror films.
This is my thing, though. This is my thing. Like, do you know another really clear example for me? And this is where like, although I can't remember exactly the year it came out, but I still feel it falls under the same kind of precipice, is Hellraiser. Because Hellraiser is genuinely scary. It is terrifying.
I find it really creepy.
Hugely. I mean, we have an episode we recorded for Halloween last year that we didn't release. But on that episode, I talked about how Hellraiser genuinely terrifies me because it really confronts you with like the fear of death and what happens after death and how terrifying it can be, whatever's waiting for you. And yet there are so many moments in it that are campy and they're funny, but it still falls under the same question of, was it a horror comedy or was it just camp?
Oh, see, with that one, I want to lean into it's just a bit camp. Like, there's the odd joke in it that's meant to be a joke, but I don't think it's ever meant to be as funny as it is.
I would agree. And I also
Yeah.
think it falls under the fact that even though the special effects were insane and the makeup and everything was insane, don't get me wrong, I'm not dissing on them at all. They were dated. In this day and age, obviously they're dated.
Yeah.
So they can come across as very campy. And I think depending on how that kind of if that's not the kind of thing that affects you and scares you, you could watch this film and think, oh, whatever. Personally, it is my nightmare.
Yeah.
But I also can't wait for the remake to come out. I'm so fucking excited.
What's so exciting and unique to Hellraiser is how it's about like experience and sensation and stuff like that. So I'm like, that really does feed into like horror and comedy, doesn't it? So I'm really excited for that. If we're going to talk about some others, we're just going to blast through these in this minisode.
Yeah.
I would say my favorite example is probably An American Werewolf in London.
Oh yeah.
Because I honestly forget how much humor is in it, but then I also end up crying by the end of the film. And I also end up quite freaked out during certain scenes, which are like really obvious. And it's like, it's not actually that they're particularly scary, but they are like a bit haunting. Maybe more because they're sad.
That's the
It's still a
word.
horror film.
That is the word. It's haunting, not even scary.
Literally.
Like I feel like if something's scary, it's like, oh God, okay, it happened in the moment. But haunting, it sits with you. That is more terrifying because if a film infiltrates your everyday life, it's done its job.
And it's funny as well because like I'm not going to go super into detail about American Werewolf in London because what more can I say? But like if you want to see a good comedy horror film, there's the obvious choices, but I feel like American Werewolf in London is one to go and watch again, looking at it as a horror comedy. But I'd say the most classic one probably is Evil Dead. Let's be real. And like it's funny because I go back to that first film and I find it creepy as fuck.
It is though.
Fucking budget they had. That's something I'd call a bit haunting. Like there's certain images in Evil Dead which are just so like they get into your brain. Like when I was a kid, I remember seeing that scene where he was guessing the cards, and she turns around. Oh my God, I couldn't get out my brain. And then when
eerie and haunting are the words.
The pencil in the fucking ankle.
And do you know what? Even though obviously I know there's a lot of horrific images in it. The Human Centipede leans into that very similar thing. One of the most traumatic moments is his Achilles heel being sliced. Despite everything that's happening, that's the bit that gets me. Why? Because it's real.
It's just so visceral and like it's like this could happen to you in 10 minutes. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
Whereas you get other things, say like Gremlins. People forget that's a horror comedy. They do. They completely forget that's a horror comedy. That would never happen.
It's also because obviously people see it as a Christmas film as well. I suppose that's it falls under that.
It has layers. But like Gremlins is funny because it's like it's so not in real life that people view it more as a comedy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's like people forget like, oh my fuck, there are scenes in Gremlins which are terrifying. Like even now, like when they first fucking revealed the actual Gremlins and like their eggs, it's like vaguely alien like.
Yes.
You know, which is it's definitely a reference. All those eggs and stuff, it's definitely.
Oh yeah.
But like you know, in Gremlins, there's the scene with the microwave when she puts one in the microwave. Do you know, like that was the scene that meant that fucking what's it called, like classification board couldn't classify the film. They were like, well, this isn't a kids film. It's not a PG. It's not, it's funny, but it's not a kids film, and it's not a straight horror film. So that film literally led to the creation of like PG-13s in America and 12s in the UK.
And you know what? That's a really good lead on and kind of promo for another episode we will be doing during these 7-day Halloween specials is animated horror and certain kids films that definitely, well, they weren't marketed as being horror films, but they have left a very horrific impression on us.
Oh my God, don't. Literally, like, there's too many to list. We'll get into it in that episode. But, like, there's so many of these films we're talking about today are, like, fucking advertised as being for way younger than they are. And it's like, this is not the movie.
I think for this mini-sode, we've said as much as we can. Like Leanna said, we could go on and on and on because there's so many. And I encourage all of our listeners to go and explore them on our Twitter and Instagram. We'll have an accumulation of the ones you should start with. But also, if you have any recommendations, leave them in the comments about YouTube video, DM us on Twitter, or just comment on any of our social media posts, because maybe in the future we'll review them. We're not a horror like podcast, but there is no denying that me
We
and
say this
Leanna
at
are
the end of
huge.
every episode, pretty
But
much.
it's so true that like we're not a horror podcast, but we're huge horror fanatics. And if there is an excuse to talk about a horror film, we will. So leave your recommendations and we'll get through them because we're horror bitches.
We really are. We hope you enjoy the rest of this week's episodes. Absolutely ecstatic about doing them. We hope you're just as excited as we are. And yeah, we look forward to the next one. If you enjoyed this one, please leave a like, subscribe, like Sky said, leave a comment, recommend some more. And that's it from us today. So we'll see you soon.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.